The Hawk That Dare Not Hunt by Day, Chapter 1. It was the month of April and time for flowers, but around me, wherever my eyes wandered, there was no sign of spring. The far shore of the Thames was only a thin gray line against a lowering sky. Beyond the near shore, the red roofs and the gray walls of London had a wintry look. Gusts of wind swept the ship's bare masts and frayed rigging. We laid anchored in mid-river, close upon the bridge, waiting for the tide to turn. The bridge surged with handcarts and horse carts, and hundreds of people going about their morning chores. Yet there was scarcely a murmur from them. The pilings of the bridge, for some reason called starlings, were so massive and close together that the tide fighting its way to the sea swept against them with an uproar that drowned out all the sounds, even the church bells of London. We stood on deck, I and the captain, my Uncle Jack, patiently waiting for the tide. The bridge looming above us, with its hundreds of shops back to back and side to side, all helter-skelter, looked like cells of a giant beehive. Off to our right was a wherry, with two men sculling back and forth against the tide. One of them a grim-faced fellow with a long, pale nose we knew by sight. Indeed, every time my Uncle Jack went ashore, he was apt to follow my uncle around, suddenly appearing in odd places, then silently slipping away. Just above us, a mournful-looking little man squeezed through a hole between two shops and shouted down to us, "Fresh eels! Nice fresh eels caught today," and brandished one of his wares at us. My Uncle Jack said, "Would you like one for supper? An eel might taste good. Good, eh? I'd prefer a large sheen of beef. What if we partake of both?" Uncle Jack said, motioning the monger to toss down one of his small eels, to celebrate our arrival. To celebrate, eh? To celebrate our being alive, I added. It was nip and tuck for a while last night. Aye, it was, especially at that moment when the mainmast split and came close to crashing down. The mainmast, mind you. Perhaps we should celebrate with a large eel instead of a small eel, a big time. Uncle Jack again called to the monger, holding his hands apart to indicate a larger size. It was a long throw from bridge to ship, a good way out and a good way down, but the monger managed it. The eel was freshly caught, as he had claimed, for despite its being flung down upon the deck from afar, it wiggled mightily and was difficult to subdue. "Slippery as our friend of the pale nose," the captain said, placing his boot upon the eel's head. Slippery. Uncle Jack was a thick-set man with paw-like hands and powerful legs. As he stepped hard upon the eel's head, there was a glint in his eye that said, "One of these days, when we meet again, I'll do the same to our curious friend." "But what if our friend turns out to be an agent of the crown?" I humbly asked, reading his thought. "Which most likely he is. That or an agent of Thomas More's, possibly a searcher." "It makes no difference," Uncle Jack answered. "An agent of one or the other, king or chancellor. A searcher, in the pay of customs. From customs, a searcher, no matter, eh?" This was a brave but foolish remark. The mere threat could land him in jail, and if he dared carry it out, it would surely cost him an ear or an eye. "King Henry's in a pocky mood," I said. "If the curious gentleman is indeed one of the king's agents, this is not the time to arouse him." In addition to Henry's past and current troubles with the emperor, the pope, and his wife Catherine, he had just experienced scarcely a month before a close brush with death. In a joust with the Duke of Suffolk, he had entered the list with the visor of his helmet open. horrified spectators had shouted to Suffolk to hold back his lance, but he could neither see that the king's face was unprotected nor hear the dire warnings. The duke's lance struck and shattered against the king's helmet, within a bare inch of his exposed face. Furthermore, and more recently, King Henry had fallen from his horse head first into a muddy river bank, nearly dying of suffocation where he was reached. This is not the moment for such things, I reminded him again, at the same time pointing over his shoulder. A short distance beyond where the eelmonger stood, near the entrance to the bridge, was a brace of pike poles, and on each of the poles was impaled a severed head. The heads had once belonged to the heretics William Stokes and Reginald Lane. 2 months before, when we were last in London, the heads of these two gentlemen were quite lifelike, having been freshly pickled and placed on display. "They have not weathered well," Uncle Jack said. "A poor job from the pickler, eh?" In truth, they had not weathered well, being badly wrinkled and of a sooty color, their long beards bedraggled. Uncle Jack himself possessed a beard. It was black, square-cut, and rested upon his chest like a neat block of wood. Gazing at the bedraggled beards, he unconsciously began to finger his own. I presume a cautionary thought ran through his mind at that moment, for he suddenly turned away and ordered me to gather up the eel and take it along to the galley. On the way back, I paused at my locker, stuffed a carefully wrapped package of printed matter into my doublet, and donned a heavy coat. I returned to the deck as the tide turned, and, taking the wheel, maneuvered the Black Pearl under the bridge. As I headed toward the Steelyard dock, I noticed that a sparrow was tugging away at what was left of Reginald Lane's beard. In a moment, the bird flew low over my head, a long hair trailing from its beak. The nest-building sparrow was the only sign of spring that I saw that morning. End of chapter 1.